The last several weeks, we have been discovering the ways that God brings hope in the face of challenges in the world that often feels like there is no hope. One of the most important things I'd like you to remember from this entire series is that the basis of the Christian faith is this bold, audacious hope. It's a hope that God is always here, that God is always with us, and that He's working in our lives every single day. It's a hope that when things are broken, that they can be mended, right? It's a hope that God has plans for us, and that He hasn't actually forgot about us, right? That He's still at work. It's a hope that our Creator loves us, still loves us, no matter what we've done. It's a hope that we don't ever have to be afraid, that things don't have to remain the same tomorrow, even as they are today. So in the first week of this series, we talked about that, how God has that promise for us, how He hasn't forgot us. And then the second week, we talked about Jesus bringing us hope when we're tired, when we're worn out, when we're overwhelmed, and how we don't have to do any of that alone. We have Jesus, but we also have each other. We have the church. And then last week, we talked about the hope that comes from the grace of Jesus Christ. When we sin, when we get broken from that sin, how we can be forgiven, but then because we've been forgiven, how we can also forgive others. So today what I want to cover, what I want to extend in this series of hope, is that we are given a hope when we feel like there are things happening to us that we just absolutely cannot handle. That the things that maybe we don't choose come barreling at us, and the fear starts to sink in, how there's still a hope even in that time. There's a reason why so many of us, what do I do with my clicker here? Let me grab this. There's a reason why so many of us love the old classic movies. Some maybe on my list here aren't as classic as others. But movies like Rudy, The Karate Kid, even Blindside, Cool Runnings. When I Googled this, do you guys remember Cool Runnings? Yeah, Nate does. A couple of you do. That was such a fun movie. But the reason I think we tend to love these kind of movies is because they all have one theme together, right? They all have this theme, this common theme. They all have a theme about an underdog, right? They're all a story about an underdog. And the film are about unlikely characters who have these overcoming amazing odds. You don't think it can happen, but yet somebody like that makes something great and wonderful happen. They're all told in different ways. They all have their own unique outcomes, but they all tell the story of the same thing, which is hope. Hope. You know, maybe we relate with these movies because somewhere along the line, we can relate with those characters and say, yeah, we know what it's like to face challenges so hard. Or if they can do it, right? And I know it's just a movie, but it still gives us hope that maybe we can do it too. You know, life is full of daunting situations all the time, right? Parenting children can be daunting. Teenagers, young adults, sorry. I was one too, I get it. But it can be very overwhelming, incredibly overwhelming. Juggling our careers and our families together can be a huge challenge to do well. Growing in our faith and defeating the habits of sin can be a great challenge. Navigating through all the lies of our world can just seem like we can't handle it, like there's just too much and it weighs too much. But that's because these things are all things that are not meant to be done alone. The Bible, we'll get off these stories here in a moment. We'll share David here. But the Bible is full of all sorts of characters who, against all odds, experience victory. People who you would look at and say there's no way they should have been able to do that. But there's a common thread in all of these stories. The characters are all fully aware that without God, they would be defeated. Without God, they can't accomplish these things, and they're not going to have a great outcome. And one of those classic underdog stories is the story of David. Now, David and Goliath, as I shared with the children, is who we're going to be focusing on today. But you know, in all honesty, yes, David was an underdog then, but I think most of David's life he was an underdog, right? And he was able to do amazing things, but not because he did it himself. It's because he, and like many of these other characters in the Bible, they knew without themselves they couldn't do it, but with God, they could do it. So at this point in the story, this is long before David was a king of Israel. He's just a young boy, no bigger, no taller, I'm sure, than Ty and Carter and some of our other young teenage boys here. His father's name is Jesse. He's one of 8 sons. In fact, he's the youngest son. And we do know by what the scripture tells us that at least 3 of those sons are off at war. So there's probably other sons that are still teenagers, but David is the youngest one. And Jesse wants him, while his brothers are out at war, he wants him to go check on them, basically. He says, take them some food, even take the captain some food. Take them these gifts, but I want you to check on your brothers and I want you to report back. Okay, and so he's concerned, probably about how the war is going, but even more so about how his sons are doing. So this is where the story starts. David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with the gifts, as Jesse had directed him. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. Soon the Israelite and Philistine forces stood facing each other, army against army. Now, most of you do know how this story goes, right? But I want you to really put yourself in this story. Picture the scene and picture what happens as we read this today. Because just hours before, David goes out here to the front line of where this battle is happening, where this massive conflict between the Israelite and the Philistine armies is happening. He's in the field taking care of sheep. Right, that's a really big difference. I'm pretty sure that, taking care of sheep is an important job, but overall, it's very clear from the beginning of the story that David got himself put into a position that he certainly didn't ever think he would be in, right? He never pictured himself there, I'm sure. It was well above his pay grade, for sure. But this was a huge change in scenery, from the field to the fight. And very rarely are we ever really prepared for the fight. The truth is that we are hardly ever prepared for anything that life throws at us. And whether it's a phone call of a diagnosis or a discovery of infidelity, a temptation to do sin, no one asks to be placed in a position where there is no clear route to victory, right? Nobody wants to be in that place. This is where David finds himself in these first few verses right here. David arrives at the front lines to check on his brothers who are fighting in the Israelite army, and it's at that point that he gets the first real look at what's really happening in this war. It continues. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and hurried out to the ranks to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks. Then David heard him shout at his usual taunt to the army of Israel. I wanted to stop here for a second and tell you what's happening here. For 40 days, okay, that's over a month. For 40 days, Goliath did this every morning and every evening. He came out and he taunted the Philistine or the Israelite army. He came out and said nasty things to them, nasty things about them. You can't fight me, you'll never win, whatever nasty things he could come up with. Right? He came out and taunted them every morning and evening for 40 days, and David just got to hear one of them. And as soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away and fight. Okay, here comes Goliath. Everybody run and fight. They run away. Have you seen the giant? The men asked. He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. Get this. This is a pretty big reward. He will give that man one of his daughters for a wife. That ought to be big enough. And the man's entire family, not just him, but his entire family will be exempt from paying taxes. Do you get the fear that is there? Okay, they really want this guy to be gone, this giant to be gone. But the fear is so big, even in the king, I'll give somebody all of this stuff if you just do it. If you just do it. So David asked the soldier standing nearby, what will a man get for killing the Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyways, that he is allowed to defy the armies of a living God, of the living God? David's like, really? That can't be true, right? And he, turns to someone else, and he's like, what's the reward? What's the reward? But notice that what's happening here is David is also announcing what he sees happening, okay? It's not just about the reward. He's also saying what this Philistine is doing, this giant, what this whole Philistine army is doing, is they're defying our living God, our almighty God. And these men gave David the same reply. They said, yes, that is the reward for killing him. But then David's oldest brother, and I was going to take this part out, but I'm going to include this in here because I think this helps us keep in perspective who David is at this moment. When David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard David talking to the men, he was angry. What are you doing around here anyways? He demanded. Can you hear it with brothers? What are you doing around here anyways? What about those few sheep? Only few, because apparently, that's all you can handle. What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle. I put this in here because I think this reminds us who David is, right? He's young. His older brother realizes, you shouldn't be here. What are you doing? And David, like every teenage child would answer, sorry, I can laugh because I can hear mine saying this. Well, what have I done now? David replied, I was only asking a question, right? Can you hear it? He walked over to some others and asked them the same thing and received the same answer. Then David's question was reported to King Saul, and the king sent for him. It's like finally the king hears word about this and wants to know who this kid is and why in the world he's here asking all these questions. You shouldn't even be here. Get going. So David goes to the king, and David says, don't worry about this Philistine. I'll go fight him. I'll do it, right? I'll fight him. And the king's reply is, don't be ridiculous. Like that's what all of our replies would be in that situation. Don't be ridiculous. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy. And he's been a man of war since his youth. But David persisted. Okay, this is the blessing of being a teenager. How many teenagers do we know that are persistent? I can do it. I can do it. Come on, just let me show you. I can do it. I can tell you, right? And David says, I have been taking care of my father's sheep and goats, he said. When a lion or a bear, pay attention to that. Not a fox, not a coyote even, but when a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I have done this to both lions and bears, and I do it to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defied the armies of the living God. This is how he does it, this last line. This is how he takes care of the lion, this is how he takes care of the bear, and this is how he's going to take care of this Philistine giant. I will do it to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defied the living God. I'm sorry, I think I have one more line here. The Lord who rescued me from the jaws of the lion and bear will rescue me from this Philistine. This is how he gets it done. Because the Lord who rescued me from the lion, from the bear, will also rescue me from this giant. You can hear in this passage the determination that David has. Even though he's just a boy, he knows someone has to stand up to this threat. Somebody has to put a stop to this. Somebody finally has to say, no more. This is done. This is over. Even though Goliath is this massive, huge warrior, strong, he's decorated, who struck fear literally in the hearts of everyone around him, he's a giant. He's terrifying. The whole Israelite army, including the king, who is a big guy himself, is literally paralyzed by this giant. However, someone has to do something, and David says, I'll do it. I'm willing to do it. But I know I won't be doing it on my own. What causes a young boy, an underdog, to take such a big task, right? Why would he even want to do this? It's all because of hope. You see, David had already seen what God can do with the lion and the bear, and that's a very, very important piece to this story. David already knows what God can do. There is already a hope in David that God can take care of this Philistine in the exact same way that he did with the lion and the bear. It's hope that with God's help, there is absolutely nothing that is impossible. Hope that even though David only has a little bit to offer, this can still happen. What David has discovered is this: if God is for us, then nothing can stand against us. Nothing can stand against us. And so Saul says, go ahead and do this. But Saul's reply to him then is, may the Lord be with you, right? May the Lord be with you, which as we know he certainly was. But we find ourselves in seasons of struggles. Sometimes we have to remind ourselves in those struggles, though, that God has already done great things in our lives too, right? If we look back at the past, like David was doing, we can see what God could really do with whatever we're facing right here and right now. When we believe that something or someone is as trustworthy as God, that gives us hope, right? It's like a child who is playing at the pool with their parents and is standing on the outside of the pool and the parents are in the water and the child just leaps and just jumps. Doesn't want to go underwater, but knows that their mother or their father are going to catch them and keep their head above water, right? And they just do it with this confidence, this hope, knowing that their parents are going to catch them. David's confidence is just like that. It comes from God's faithfulness, and it's the drive that he literally needs to overcome this. So let's finish out the story here. He picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into his shepherd's bag. Then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. Goliath walked out toward David with his shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at his ruddy-faced boy. Am I a dog, he roared at David, that you come at me with a stick? And he cursed David by the names of his gods. Come over here, and I'll give you your flesh to the birds and wild animals, Goliath yelled. David replied to the Philistine, you come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head. And then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. Saul, the king of Israel at the time, he tries to fit David into his armor, into a man's armor. And you can imagine that didn't go very well. So David basically says, this thing slows me down so much I can't even do anything with it. So he totally says no to any kind of armor. So as if David just being a young boy wasn't enough, he now has absolutely no armor on him and goes out with just a slingshot and 5 smooth stones. That's it. And after Goliath breathes out his threats to this little underdog, David responds by telling him that you're fighting with sword, you're fighting with a spear, you're fighting with a javelin. Not me. I'm fighting with something even bigger and even better. I'm fighting with my Lord. This is what, oh, I didn't finish that last one. Forgive me. We'll get this piece too here. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. What we really need is to fight our battles just like this. We need to have that same confidence and fight our battles just like that. And maybe you don't feel equipped to overcome the things that you're facing, or maybe you know that your trials are just too much for you. And first, may I just say, you're in good company, right? Because there's many of us that feel that same way or have felt that same way. But look, it's only when we realize that our battles are not waged in conventional ways, that our battles are fought more in a spiritual sort of way, that we will begin to fight with God, that we will begin to realize what God can really do. See, David knew that this wasn't just a physical battle. It really was so much more than that. There was a spiritual battle going on. In fact, Paul addresses this spiritual battle, and he says in Ephesians, "For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in the dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places." Right? So there's evil going on that's much bigger than what we can see, than what we can feel, than what we can touch, than what we can pick up right here. Right? There's this whole other war going on, and David already recognizes this. Paul's saying if our battles are not really about the physical world around us, then we can't overcome them in physical ways. It's just as simple as that. We can't overcome them in physical means. It takes a spiritual approach. We fight our daunting battles by submitting to the will of God. We fight the most difficult circumstances by bringing them to God in prayer. We fight the evil that we come against by inviting God to come in and to intervene in that. David calls upon God as he engages Goliath in battlefield. And with a single stone, a precise hit, right square in the head, the giant goes down. That doesn't make any sense, does it? Not in the physical world, but in the spiritual one it sure does, because God took him down. This single victory then turns the tide for the whole battle, right? It changes everything that's going on. All of a sudden, as we saw here, David then ran over, pulled Goliath's sword from his sheath. David used it to kill him and cut off his head. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they turned and ran. And then As the Philistines are running away, what happens? The men of the Israel and Judah army gave a great shout of triumph and rushed after the Philistines, chasing them as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron. Suddenly, once the frightened Israelite army realizes that God was involved, okay, a single slingshot didn't necessarily just take this man down. They realize all of a sudden God is involved. They have this huge amount of hope just pour through them. And they take off, right? And it's absolutely amazing. They know that they can be a part of this triumph with God. They can do this too. And it's all because hope is contagious. David gave them hope in a small, small way, but God gave them hope in a really big way. And hope is contagious. David's hope in God spreads like wildfire. The entire story changes. The entire narrative takes a new tone. It's no longer about defeat. Now the rest of the story is all about victory. There's something that happens in a fellowship of faith when just one person has the audacity to believe that there is that kind of hope in God and that God can do great things. The church benefits greatly from just one person within the congregation that has a little bit of hope, because that hope is contagious. Hope spreads. It begins with one person in the congregation who believes that God can use them to help lift people out of poverty. It begins with one person in the congregation who wants to see children out of our community take place in Vacation Bible School and see how amazing and wonderful God is through that. It takes place when one person with a heart for people overseas wants to see great things happen, want to go to different worlds where they don't have the things we have. It takes one person who believes that prayer actually changes things. That one person could be any of you. Any of you. It could be the spark that ignites our entire church and begins the wildfire, and it just spreads and goes everywhere. Ancient church father Thomas Aquinas said it this way: faith has to do with things that are not seen, and hope with things that are not at hand. Okay, so in other words, we might not be able to see it, and we might not be able to touch it. Even though you cannot see how God might come through in a situation, faith is believing that it's still possible, that he still will. And when a whole church begins to function that way, that is when the whole world starts to change, yes. So my God, your God, is more powerful than any force in this entire universe. And together, we can do amazing things with him. Amazing things. If God is with me, then there is literally absolutely nothing that I cannot overcome. Excuse me. David was a young boy when he decided to go toe-to-toe with this giant. Just a young boy. But it didn't matter his age. Everyone there was scared of this giant, was afraid. They were right, though, to be afraid of this giant, right? The only way they were going to win that battle was with God. So it didn't matter if David was young, if he was old. Didn't matter who did it. They just needed to do it with God. God will always help us to be the overcomers. He will always see us through to that. There's no enemy you can face in this life that God cannot give you victory over. That's what we need to remember. All we need to do is trust that God is still there and that God can do it.